in place, right? So it should be fine. But yeah, I mean, this is just it's crazy.
Yeah, it's totally crazy.
Can we just remind everyone to mute yourselves if you're not speaking?
We'll give it just maybe a half a minute more and then we're going to get started. I see a few more participants joining. Okay, I think we're good to go. Good afternoon, or maybe good morning out west there. Really want to thank all of you for joining us for what is really for CORD, a very different kind of a webinar than we've had, addressing a topic that we have not addressed so far, and we desperately need to as we're building our new rare disease drug strategy. So, Angela, can you just put up the slides? Oh, thank you very much. So my name is Durham Walriker, and I am President and CEO of the Canadian Organization for Rare Disorders. And this is one of our webinars that is in the process of moving towards the establishment of what was going to be Canada's first rare disease drug strategy, program, framework. I think we're going to need to settle on a name pretty soon, but really the agency, that is going to be able to administer rare disease therapies throughout Canada. So we're very excited about this. Those of you who have participated before, welcome back, and thank you so much for your continuous support and for your interest in these. This is a lead up in terms of what we're hoping will be another series that will be taking place in the new year towards what we're not yet ready to call the launch, but I think pretty close to it. So the topic of this webinar is equity through diversity and inclusion. And I have to say, this is something that is so very exciting to me, and certainly something that we recognize even within the rare diseases community, we have not actually addressed sufficiently. But what we thought is we've got a really diverse panel that is going to help us walk through these issues. We're also going to encourage you, and those of you who have been with us before, to use the chat box to put your comments in, to add your questions to it. And if there are questions, we're hoping that we can get to them to give to our panelists to discuss. It really enhances the conversation for people to be actively using the chat line. So I'm going, I think as I was starting with is that why we've felt this was so important is that we're moving towards, hopefully, the establishment of the first national framework for rare disease drug access. What we want to make sure is that we're able to have equitable access right across all of the rare disease populations. And what we do recognize as patients living with and as healthcare providers supporting patients with rare diseases, that, you know, even within our rare communities, there's a great deal of diversity. And even within our rare populations, there's also huge, you know, gaps that we probably don't even realize, that are part and parcel of the healthcare system, part and parcel of our Canadian system, but also very much part and parcel of rare diseases. So this is the opportunity for us to at least begin to address it and to also think deliberately, how are we going to structure our new rare disease drug program that we are going to be able to be inclusive and to be able to ensure that we do have equity. I kind of call this equity through diversity and inclusion. I know we talk about, you know, diversity, but what we recognize is, you know, the real goal is equity. Equitable access for everybody who could be in need, equitable access for everybody who could be benefiting from, equitable access for everybody who really requires a diagnosis and being able to get access to a specialist. How are we going to achieve that? One of the things we have to do, of course, is recognize that within our communities, there's tremendous diversity. As I said, even within a rare disease community, even within an ultra rare community, there are people that are not necessarily represented for lots of reasons. Some of those, of course, are in fact ethnic and racial, cultural. Some of them are really based on, you know, socioeconomic factors. Some of them are based on geographic factors. Some of them are based on literacy factors. These are all issues that are relevant to the broader system, and certainly within the rare disease community are present. It just may be that we are going to have to do a bit more deliberate work in order to make sure that we address that diversity, because in fact we may have fewer resources, they may be much harder to identify, and in fact our ability to actually ensure their inclusion may be somewhat limited. But I say that maybe because I don't know that we've done it. I'm really delighted with the panel that we've got here. I think we've got the list of panelists. Okay, yeah, and I'm very excited because most of these are not my usual suspects. Some of them, a few of them are. So what you'll see is I'm really delighted that Dr. Cheryl Rockman-Greenberg is here, and she's going to talk to us and give some of her experiences and expertise in dealing with various communities that are within that rare and geographically distant communities. Devorah Rickler, who's from Roche, Canada, who really, you know, sits as one of my heroes in terms of trying to bring in the patient voice, but also has spoken and really, I think, is trying to move in terms of Canada, especially industry, towards greater inclusion and recognition of diversity. I'm really excited to introduce Conrad Powell, who is with Diabetes Action Canada. Met him through another panel that we were both on. Was certainly really impressed with the work that he's doing, especially what he's been able to do with Indigenous youth with diabetes, and hoping that he can share some of that experience with us, and that it will be helpful for us in terms of being able to further how do we absolutely deal with not just diversity, but inclusion in our rare disease initiatives going forward. Catherine Walvin, who many of you will know, who's a newly elected board member at CORD, but who's been involved in the patient advocacy community with spinal muscular atrophy for a good number of years, and has really been able to help us understand some of the challenges, especially with some of the language diversity. Riyad Elbard, who has been on the board of CORD for so many years, and is also president of the Thalassemia Foundation of Canada, and has, I think, through TFC, been able to really bridge some challenges in terms of diversity, even within the thalassemia community, and certainly the thalassemia community as it is represented here in Canada. And I think the organization has done some brilliant work there. Really happy to have Sherry Caldwell, who came to us a number of years ago, really with some strong interest in terms of the rare diseases, not because she was focused on rare, but because she is a real strong leader in terms of disabilities, and is head of the Ontario Disabilities Council, and really is very active in terms of ensuring that those with disabilities are also equitably represented, equitably served throughout not just Ontario, but really does do some amazing kinds of leadership work that reflects throughout Canada. So really thrilled when I reached out that she was willing to come and speak to us about the role in terms of the Disabilities Council, but also some of the advice that we might be able to use from that for moving forth with the rare diseases community. And I really want to give a real special welcome to Samara Ahmed, who is with the Samara Foundation for NMO. Samara and I met this past year and literally met in real life in Washington at the World Orphan Drug Congress. So we had connected. And I am so inspired by the work that she's doing in terms of certainly within the community for NMO in the US, but also what she's doing to reach out internationally in terms of creating this foundation or creating inclusion for people living with NMO across very diverse regions for, again, a very small patient population. So a huge welcome to everybody. What I'd like to do is I'm going to go directly into some of the Q&A in advance of this. But really, maybe, and if you skip through the questions first, and then we'll get to what I want to do, is hopefully all of you are well aware of what we're doing in terms of a national rare disease framework. We know that, Health Canada, or the government of Canada, allocated $1 billion to set up a national framework for rare diseases in Canada. That we have been working very hard since last year to really outline what we feel are the requirements of that framework, how it should be set up. Health Canada itself did a consultation last year and came out with a report, the What We Heard report, which we felt strongly reflected the thinkings that certainly our communities have been engaged in and presenting over the past year. So we really feel that we're on a very strong path forward with the governments and certainly with other policy groups and with other key players within the system, including groups like CADIS, including certainly our industry partners in the research community, the healthcare professional community. We feel like, I think everybody is really more or less on that same page. So this is very exciting. And of course, with the re-election of the Liberal government in this past, I think we're going to be able to hopefully move seamlessly from what was recommended, what was discussed, into the establishment of a rare disease drug strategy or framework. We have, I think, informally been at least led to believe that we can get this set up for the beginning of the next fiscal year, April 2022. Not that we're expecting a giant, building. We're not expecting bricks and mortars, and we're not expecting a full-blown program, but we do expect that we will be able to establish this as a platform that we can begin to look at how we're going to bring in rare disease therapies to our patients in a much more streamlined, expeditious, managed process. So I would just briefly reiterate the 12 steps that we recommended towards a real quick start to a rare disease drug program. I won't go into it in detail, but you will see here very strongly the importance of patient empowerment. You will see that we're talking about needing to invest in research and development in terms of our healthcare community, in terms of our academic community, in terms of the partnerships that we have with the industry. Obviously, the most important part is the speed of access to treatment. And there are things that we can do to ensure that we've got mechanisms that start with preclinical and then clinical trials, early access programs, and being able to make sure that we can bring these in with a monitored, managed approach. Next. Sorry, I'm barreling through this because I know many of you have been involved with this before. The regulatory barriers, we need to be able to address those. First and foremost, for many of us, have been the assurance that the PMPRB guidelines do not interfere with what is going to be the ability to bring in drugs in a highly timely process, in a competitive process with regard to their entry into Canada. The ongoing improvement in terms of the regulatory approvals, building on what Health Canada has already started in terms of the modernization, but to ensure that we continue on the pathway towards harmonization, towards joint international approvals. pathways for special cases. We still have a huge problem, as many of you know, in terms of being able to get early access, special access, and to be able to actually have dedicated programs that will allow patients to get access as soon as a drug is deemed to be potentially viable for them after the safety issues have been addressed. Funding opportunities, I think this is something that we've all really been struggling with, is that there need to be ways in which we can identify, certainly unmet needs, certainly identifying the challenges that diverse populations have. And this might be an area in which we had not identified before, but really thinking about, are there some special kinds of funding pathways that need to be put in place in terms of diverse populations? Next slide. Managed access programs, which is the core of what we feel is the process for which we're going to be approving drugs. And this is not just us in Canada. This is what we're seeing internationally across the globe. Everybody recognizes bringing in drugs, early access with limited clinical, preclinical data at the time of approval means that we need to be able to better monitor these drugs as they're made available, but that we do not want to full stop in terms of getting what could be years-long collection of evidence in a controlled environment before we make them available. So a whole shift in terms of focusing on early access with real-world evidence. And then the rest of it, I think it really does speak to that. The last, and certainly not the least, is making sure our centers of clinical expertise not only enhance, but we have investments into them that we're linking them. So that's kind of our step process. And if you can go back to the questions that we are going to ask this panel, I think this is what I want to do. All right. So this is going to open up then for me. This is going to be a discussion among the panelists. I'm going to hopefully do very little. The way we're going to do it is that I like to pose the question, maybe identify somebody who will lead off in the answering of that question, and then identify others who would I like to bring into the conversation. But I'm opening it up to our panelists to say, if you want to build on something that somebody else has said, you can either signal by raising your hand if you want to do it formally, or if you want to just kind of, to start to speak and to actually have an opinion on it. I think I'm very much open to making this a genuine discussion. You're the experts. You're the ones that are actually helping us in terms of addressing this issue. So I'm going to keep it open to be a very, very open discussion among you. It's for us, in the rare disease space, it's a relatively unaddressed area. So I think we're looking forward to you bringing in your expertise. So I'm going to start with any questions, comments, concerns anybody has? Okay, and again, so I'd like to really start to talk about the patient populations that you represent or serve and what's the role and mission of your organization. But before we go there, maybe I'll hand it over to Cheryl, to Dr. Greenberg, because I know she has a couple of slides and she's going to help us put us into position in terms of understanding some of the challenges in terms of rare and ultra rare and dealing with and addressing the diversities there. And do we have her slides?
Yep, just pulling them.
Okay. Cheryl, so I'm going to turn it over to you. Cheryl, for those of you, just introduce yourself briefly, but I think most of us know Cheryl as one of the huge heroes in our healthcare environment in terms of supporting patients, not just with rare diseases, but especially for us. As I say, she's one of our national treasures in this area. So Cheryl, over to you.
Okay. Thank you, Doreen. Can you hear me? Can you see me? I'd like to be a little bit of both.
Yes and yes.
Okay, that's good. I'm during Doreen's introduction, she mentioned, inviting panelists, and that some of the panelists are her usual suspects. I would consider myself one of her usual suspects. And we go back a long way, and I'm very, very pleased just to lead off this panel discussion. I know that there are a lot of people on the panel and that we only have an hour. So I'll just very, very briefly introduce my role. I'm a metabolic geneticist, a pediatrician as well, who's practiced metabolic genetics as a clinician and as a clinician scientist in Winnipeg at the University of Manitoba and with Shared Health Manitoba, really for 42 years. And Winnipeg is my home, and I'm proud to call it my home. I just wanted to say that from my role as a metabolic clinician and as a researcher, I have completely immersed myself in understanding what health equity is all about. But please, I am no expert in health equity, and I just realized that it's so important for us in the world of rare diseases to achieve health equity, and it poses a tremendous challenge to our integrity of our public health system. And really, I use this slide, which was given to me by several colleagues. What does equity really mean? If we lived in a world where there was equality, everybody was equal, you could already see that those who are somewhat disadvantaged wouldn't have the same view and the same viewpoint and be able to have access to the same world that other people do. So to achieve this equal playing field so that everybody has the same access in our privileged society to advances in diagnosis and treatment, something has to be done to achieve equity. And this is this is a very telling side. Of course, if there were no barriers, we'd all have equitable access to the improved diagnoses and to the rapidly increasing number of treatments. But this is not our real world, even in our privileged society. And we have to do something to promote equity in the world of rare diseases. And my fundamental philosophy is that whether you have a common disease or a rare disease, people with rare diseases should have equitable access to same proven treatments as people with common diseases. And what do we have to do to achieve this? Well, clearly, Doreen pointed out in her 12 steps, things can be done to ensure equity. At my institution, at the University of Manitoba, I can honestly say, and to Shared Health Manitoba, our health services delivery model, there have been enormous attempts in the world of EDI, of equity, diversity, and inclusivity. And I take the messages I learned from my colleagues more expert in the field and something that has been done at the institutional level and with the health service delivery model to ensure equity. And really, it starts with a philosophy, and we have a formal policy in place at the University of Manitoba. It's called Disruption of All Forms of Racism Policy. And it's really a very telling document, and it's one of the first in Canada. So our university and Shared Health Manitoba are taking very aggressive stands to combat systemic racism in education, in healthcare, and in research. And I think, the policies that are put in place provide to me a good framework to how to apply these fundamental principles to my world of rare diseases and things that I've done over the past many years. Well, most recently, I signed to our MP in Ottawa, a basic income letter. I have written off and taken courses in how to write effective EDI statements. To me, it's a continual learning process, and I really, with the world of rare diseases that I work in, I will do whatever I can to ensure equity so that there is no differential treatment of our patients and their families with rare diseases by a dominant culture that has disadvantaged our patients for so many years. I've talked even in philanthropic meetings about, even in philanthropy, to make sure our workforce in the philanthropic world is representative of the patients whom we serve. I totally believe in the concept of equity through diversity and inclusivity. And I try to practice this every day and take messages from my institutional leaders. And other things that worked in Manitoba that have taken the lead is something like Jordan's Principle for our Indigenous patients who do not have access to equitable diagnostic or treatments. We have a federal principle policy now, Jordan's Principle, that ensures access to proven treatments to our Indigenous patients when there is a problem in terms of reimbursement, whether it's the feds or the provinces. We also, of course, take the land acknowledgement that we say before every public meeting very seriously. And, people have said, well, why do you still put the land acknowledgement? Everybody knows what land acknowledgement is all about. And really, that is what equity is all about. Sometimes you have to take that extra step to ensure people are aware of the needs of others who are more privileged. So I think I will stop here. Doreen, I hope I haven't talked too long. I know there's many people. And I want to just go to the next slide and thank our Dean of Medicine, who has taught me, Brian Postal, who's taught me a great deal about health equity and what we all have to do at the personal and the professional level to ensure that we treat everybody the same. In my world, that's the world of rare diseases, and know about enough of, and to share the knowledge I have gained and continuing to gain about the world of rare disease to understand how to incorporate health equity in everything that I do on a day-to-day basis. So thanks, Doreen.
Thank you, Cheryl. And I was not wrong when we were saying, who can we get to lead this office, a healthcare professional? Because I think Cheryl not only brings in some of the principles of philosophy, but she lives it every single day. And I've seen that in action. So kudos to you. I'm going to stay at a high level for the moment and maybe just turn to Devorah Richler. Again, it was almost a no-brainer when we were thinking about who we're going to get from the industry to speak to this. And Devorah, your name came right to the top of my mind, just in terms of the personal interactions we've had. So, I'm not going to actually speak for the entire industry. I'm not going to actually speak for the entire Roche, but maybe you can just introduce yourself and really give us your perspectives in terms of how, from an industry point of view, and certainly for rare diseases, if you can, although I know you're not an expert in the rare diseases community, really, how do we go about addressing this to ensure that we, are going to be able to have equity in terms of access, or reducing the barriers, as Cheryl has very much said.
Thanks, first of all, Durhan, for inviting me to be here today, because I'm really excited. And it's when someone like you says that I'm your hero or one of your heroes, that's, I don't even know how I can speak after that. So thank you so much for inviting me. I work for Hoffmann-La Roche. You might know us as Roche. And we are the world's largest biotech company, which of course can be viewed as positive, but also as negative by many people. So that's where we sort of start in the industry. Our mission and vision is about innovation in healthcare. We are a truly innovative company. We don't make copies of medications, and we don't make other versions of medications. We innovate. And our goal is to help patients live longer and better. Our tagline is doing now what patients need next. So what we're trying to think about is, how do we serve our populations now with what they need now, while also considering innovation for the future? So I'm the head of a program called Soaring with Roche, and Soaring with Roche has 5 pillars. And one of the first pillar that I always talk about, and the most important one to me, is actually health justice. So it's really timely that we just launched the program 2 weeks ago. It's really timely that I've been invited to speak here today. And, I think there's so much that we need to do. And a lot of it, I agree with everything that Cheryl said. And, we need to be doing outreach. We need to be listening better. We need to be unlearning what we have learned and unlearning the ways we have learned things, and really think about new approaches. And so, I'm really proud to work at Roche, because we actually view diversity and inclusion as a catalyst for innovation. And we actually think that, our differences are our strengths. And so our company focuses on, psychological safety as one example. So letting people show up exactly the way they are and bring their value to the organization based on what they are themselves. And we also try to help people create new roles for themselves that are based on their passions and what they can bring to the table. We do the land acknowledgments because we believe that's really important. We are, I just finished the Indigenous Canada course with the University of Alberta, and I'm encouraging all of my colleagues to do the same, because I learned so much. We try to make sure we're using the right language. We all make sure everyone knows what our pronouns are, and we want to make sure that gets into the vernacular and everybody becomes accustomed to that language. So I think we have a responsibility as an industry, but also, and for Roche as the largest biotech company, to lead in this way and lead in a diverse and inclusive way. And the diversity is one piece. It's making sure that you have a diverse population in your organization and who you meet with and talk to and you know, collaborate with and co-create with. But it's also about that co-creation, that actual co-creation itself, and the inclusion part of the puzzle. So I think it's not enough to just have diversity. We also need to embrace that diversity through inclusion. And maybe I'll pause there because I know there's a lot of people.
There are a lot of people, and that's exactly what I think I was hoping that you could bring in, because, certainly my engagement with Roche, right, is really looking at how do we go back to personalizing healthcare? How do we actually look at the individual there? And that really does mean the individual in terms of all the diversity that's there, but also doing it in a proactive way. So thank you very, very much. And very much appreciate, I think, the many projects that you've been able to do. Let me then just move very quickly over to Conrad. And Conrad, I've only met through some of the, I don't think I ever met you face to face. No, we've only met kind of through the screen. So, but Conrad, maybe you can kind of just give us a little bit of a quick example of what your background is, but also love to understand, where and how that, Indigenous project for youth with diabetes.
Sure thing. Thank you very much. So my name is Conrad Powell. I'm a senior project manager at Diabetes Action Canada, and I manage the National Diabetes Repository. And I just want to pick on one thing that Dvora said, which I really love. And she said the word health justice. And so everybody talks about EDI. So we actually put the Star Wars Jedi in there. So it's JEDI. Because now we need to look at health justice as one of the things that we need to look at. So us at Diabetes Action Canada, we're a pan-Canadian research organization. We're funded through CIHR's SPORE program. This is the Strategy for Patient-Oriented Research. And what our focus really is, it's to put patients at the forefront of research. So how do we bring patients, their caregivers, and researchers together to identify health concerns that actually matter to those living with diabetes, and then to actually co-create research programs. So get the patient involved in what we do. So everything we do at Diabetes Action Canada is patient co-created. The development of our National Diabetes Repository, it's a patient co-created platform where patients said, we want our data in a secure environment. We want the right to know who's accessing our data, and we want to approve projects. So researchers actually submit a proposal, and our research governing committee is made up of 50% patients. They say, yes, this project actually is in the best interest of patients, or this is meaningful to us. And when we talk about patients, we realize the patient's voice needs to be heard. And so Diabetes Action Canada has an Indigenous patient circle. It has a Francophone and immigrant patient circle. And every project we do needs to have a patient partner part of it. Our Indigenous patient circle got together and they had a series of gatherings and tried to figure out with research teams, what are the important challenges amongst their communities? How can we work together to actually overcome these or make it easier for them to access? And their mission is Indigenous partners empowering holistic approaches to wellness. Diabetes Action Canada works with the Indigenous Youth Mentorship Program to create a safe place for the Indigenous youth to express their feelings, to tell us what barriers they're facing, to co-create platforms to help us deliver community-friendly information that is with their communities. And then again, with the whole equity, diversity, and inclusion, we are doing a big demonstration project right now with community health centers in Ontario. So looking at the vulnerable and marginalized communities and seeing who hasn't had the preventative screening that they need in order to not develop diabetic retinopathy. And so we know the community health centers are the recent immigrants, the homeless, the low income. So we're actually doing a study now where we're not only identifying individuals who haven't had the screening, but we're actually taking that data back to the family physicians and the circle of care and having them directly contact these patients and saying, you haven't had your preventative screen and we can actually set you up for this with the teleretina program in Ontario. So it's the first stage that, you know, patients have said our greatest fear from diabetes is developing blindness and limb amputation. And that's what we're focused on. And so we're starting to merge the research with clinical care based on what the patients want. So in a nutshell, that's kind of what we do, or kind of what I do through the digital health arm of Diabetes Action Canada.
Thank you so much, Conrad. You packed so much in terms of that very brief presentation. And I really want to encourage all of us in the rare disease community to think about what we can pull through from what Conrad's talking about, you know, certainly in diabetes, which is for the most part not a rare disease, though, to be honest with you, diabetes type 1 is rare under the strict definitions of prevalence, and also certainly juvenile diabetes continues to be rare. So in some degrees, what you're talking about really resonates, but it also says what we often struggle with, and that is with a small patient population, how do you actually go about doing that? And I love the fact that, as you say, we use the patient records to actually proactively identify those who, because they are not necessarily in that mainstream, are being left out, but we also then create those inclusion circles so that people are part of the conversation. And I'm going to come back hopefully at the end with some time to come forth with some recommendations that I think I've heard. Before I go much further then, and really we're going to run so far out of time, I should have planned this as a 3-hour seminar. Good gosh, eh? Sherry, I'm going to turn to you. You've been an active participant. I've seen you show up on a lot of our webinars so far, and you've continued to contribute a great deal. I mean, your Facebook is something that I get all the time. But tell us a little bit about what you're trying to achieve with the Ontario Disabilities Council, and kind of what learnings you've had that might actually relate to us as we're moving forth in terms of rare diseases and a rare disease drug access program.
Sure. So I'm Sherry Caldwell, and it's actually the Ontario Disability Coalition.
Oh, coalition, sorry.
That's okay. And we actually started in 2017, and we advocate with the provincial government to improve access to Ontario health services. And it really came about when the government rolled out the Ontario Autism Program, because many families and caregivers of parents with rare diseases felt really discriminated against, and even to this day, to access rehabilitation, physiotherapy, speech, and OT. It is very hard in Ontario's health services because of we felt discriminated based on our children's diagnosis. But since starting that organization, we received many emails from adults across the spectrum, and we actually spend a lot of time advocating for to eliminate discrimination for people that are facing poverty because of their disability. There's enormous barriers in our home care system, especially now with the nursing crisis, which is felt across Canada. And as well as therapy. So we try to encourage people across Ontario to speak up, to share their stories, and we want to be heard at Queen's Park. So we work with the media. One person, Anthony Brazzini, which is a director at ODC, he has his own spin on EDI, and it's to add an A. So IDEA, so inclusion, diversity, equity, and access. So we really need accessible access for people, not just physical barriers, and also attitudinal barriers. So that's our own little spin on that. So thank you, Conrad and Cheryl. I liked your twists on it too.
That's amazing. So thank you so much. And thank you, Sherry, for continuing to advocate on behalf of everybody. And I think a lot of times we do kind of miss the adult community as well, you know, and the needs to make sure that the services that are available are accessible to everybody. I like the access spin on it as well. It really is what we're trying to move forward. And you cannot have equity unless you're, I think, as Cheryl Greenberg showed to us very earlier, unless you remove those barriers. So kudos to you. I'm so totally, despondent by the fact that I'm going to run out of time here, but maybe I can just switch over quite quickly over to Catherine then. Catherine, can you kind of help us understand some of the diversity that you feel we need to address? Certainly, as we're moving forward, and those that you have certainly had some real experience with and have been able to speak on behalf of.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Thanks for having me once again, Durhan. It's amazing to be part of this panel. I think everything we've heard so far is very inspiring and speaks really well to a lot of issues that we're looking at today. And I know I have some lived experience with certain barriers having to do with disability mostly. At the same time, I am in a privileged position in the sense that I do live in a big urban city. I have resources that allow me to be able to have transportation to get to my appointments, to have access to the treatments that I need. But for someone living with a disability who happens to live outside of an urban center, just in terms of getting to an appointment, getting to a specialist, going to a hospital or care center to get a treatment or to get specialized care, that is, a very sort of immediate physical barrier in terms of, do I have a vehicle that I can travel in that's adapted? Do I have someone who can accompany me to my appointment if I need to be driven or if I need that type of assistance? So that means taking time off work possibly for a caregiver or even for the person that is going for care or treatment. So those are very real barriers. They're not necessarily always easy to get over, in the sense that in terms of rare conditions, we know that treatments or care can be highly specialized. Thankfully, with technology advancements, hopefully those are things that can help us get through those barriers and access people that are living in a very vast, diverse geographical region. I like also what I'm hearing about representation and listening to people with lived experience. I think that is something that still needs to be worked on, certainly in terms of our government institutions. People with certain disabilities or who come from certain cultural backgrounds are used to being spoken to and not listened to. In terms of healthcare and also in terms of just our policies in our government healthcare system, who can tend to have a sort of paternalistic way of dealing with certain populations without listening to what their true needs are. And sometimes those solutions come from those people with that lived experience. And the solutions are often not as complicated or, expensive as, people in decision-making positions might think. So there is ways of building bridges, I think, and reaching out as early as possible in a process of consultation, of building programs, of building policies. So reaching out and getting those representatives from those communities that are underserved.
Thank you very, very much, Catherine. And you certainly have done that for us as well, within court. So we appreciate it. I got to get to two more people. So I really want to make sure that we do, because they're such valuable people. Riyadh, I'm going to turn to you because I know that, you've been involved with thalassemia, well, in your entire life, but you've also probably feel like you've been president of the Thalassemia Foundation for your entire life as well, coming in and out of it. And we do recognize that one of the challenges around thalassemia, of course, is some of the new patients that are coming in are immigrant patients and do not necessarily represent, the traditional thalassemia, network that's here. What have you guys been able to do to actually be able to embrace, the new ones?
Thank you, Durhan. And what I've been hearing, I'm going in my head that all these that have been mentioned by Dr. Greenberg really it intersects at the heart, at the core of the thalassemia community. And thalassemia, just briefly to let everybody know, is a genetic blood disorder where the body doesn't make enough red blood cells. So blood transfusions cures the anemia, but in itself, it creates a whole bunch of other complications and needs more care and attention. So the treatment is continuous, it's a chronic disease, and it's lifelong. Now we've got into right now with medical advances where there are some disease enhancement and even gene therapy on the horizon that promise, very possibly a cure, which is really great. But then again, the cost and the funding of all these treatments, which we talked about at many previous CORD events. But the population of thalassemia was originally from those who came from the Mediterranean. So it was the South Europe, the Middle East, just slightly, like from myself, Lebanon, and some other countries in that region. But over the last 30 years, we've seen more of those who are coming from East Asia, from China, Hong Kong, Philippines, Vietnam, and then from Southeast Asia, from India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and all sorts of other countries. So that has been a big shift about 30 years ago. But then in the last 7 or 10 years, it's been even a bigger shift, and that has been more of immigrants who are coming as refugees from war-torn countries like Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan. And now we're embracing ourselves for the new influx of Afghani refugees. And you really see those diverse mix of and the challenges of language barriers, culture barriers, even some of them come with really severe trauma in their lives, coming from those war-torn countries. It's not only the ethnic diversity that we're dealing with, also there's been a diversity in the genetic mutations in thalassemia, because you do have the alpha thalassemia and you do have the hemoglobin H, which are not entirely dependent on thalassemia. So there's a variation even in the treatment itself, as well as all these other factors. The biggest challenge we're facing now is these new settlers or newcomers to Canada are actually placed in cities like Halifax, like Hamilton, like Ottawa, all across Canada, in not necessarily very small cities, but in smaller towns, London, Ontario, where there has not been a center program to care for hemoglobinopathies. We know we have good centers in Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal, but then when you have these patients in these other cities, the complexities and the challenges are amplified. First of all, we don't have proper programs to treat those patients. The other thing is the socioeconomic factors are really impacting the patients and their families. And we often don't talk about the burden of the disease on the families. So I'm having calls recently from parents of pretty much the mother of patients who the husband is busy with work, trying to earn bread for the family. And she has to take care of 4 or 5 children, one of them or sometimes 2 who has thalassemia, and she has to take them to regular follow-ups, appointments, her own thing. So she's not even able to carry the usual things that she would need to do. Not to mention that even if she wants to work and realize her own goals and ambitions, that's going to become difficult. But really, there is not the support for all of these needs. And these are where we are trying to address that. We're just sort of scratching the surface on that. And we are trying to, we need to do a survey to find out what are these needs, both in terms of funding and access to drugs, access to medications, and those other needs that the families have, which we really try not to support because we feel the system should be responsible for that, not a small health charity like ours, which, if in a good year we raise like 80,000 or 100,000. So it's not feasible, it's not sustainable. So that's what we're trying to get at. And also the inequality in access to care. We have patients who are in some hospitals who get, like there are patients who use a small pump to inject Desferal, and they get all the supplies associated with that, like sub-Q sets, even alcohol swabs. But in some other locations, they don't have any of that, and they're struggling on where do we find this? Who will fund this for us? What can we do? So what I'm saying here is we need to really look deeper at those needs. We need to even change our way of educating patients, as Devora was mentioning, that we need to, unlearn what we have learned. We can't just talk about beta thalassemia. We need to talk about the other forms of thalassemia, and we need to talk about all these other things that patients need to really address and support those patients. The other thing is when you have things like gene therapy and you want to include patients in, setting up clinical trials, how do you engage those people? You want to engage everybody. These are the patients who are probably going to benefit the most from these new treatments. So you want to make sure you have their feedback, their input, engage them on all these discussions. So these are the challenges. COVID hasn't helped because it would have been easier to go and visit those various locations, meet with the patients, interact. We try to do it in virtual settings, and that's the real struggle that we are facing. But we are looking at these things, and that's going to be our focus for the next 2 to 3 years.
Oh, wow, that's so amazing, Riyadh. That is so powerful in terms of what you've presented. I knew that there was a story there and a lot more because we are very close to the thalassemia community, but who knew that it was going to be, challenges upon challenges. And now I really need to pivot very quickly to Samara, who I'm so grateful has taken the time to join us today and really bring some of her, kind of thinking. Samara, can you introduce yourself? Because I think, you've have certainly kind of come onto the scene, and I'm really impressed with what you're trying to do to raise awareness, but also to do inclusive in terms of setting up an international group around NMO, almost as a one woman mission there.
Oh, thank you so much. I hope you can all hear me. It's such an honor to be here.
Excuse me. If somebody got their sound on. Yeah, thank you. Okay. There.
Thank you for having me, Dirhan.
We've lost your video, Samara.
Oh, did you? Do you see me now?
No, you're such a beautiful person. We need to see you.
Oh no, hold on one second. Hold on. It says you cannot start your video because the host has stopped it.
Oh, well, that's not a good idea. Continue speaking. We'll try to get it started again.
Okay, great. So thank you for having me, Dirhan. I feel very privileged to be sitting or, somewhat sitting next to all of these wonderful panelists. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Samara. I am the founder and executive director of an organization I started 7 years ago called the Samara Foundation. Can you see me now?
We do indeed. Oh, there you are.
Hello. So I got diagnosed with a rare autoimmune disease 7 years ago called neuromyelitis optica. It's a rare autoimmune disease that affects the optic nerves and spinal cord, leaving patients blind and or paralyzed, no cure. When I got sick, there were no available therapies for us. Everything was very much off-label therapy use. The awareness was lacking for sure. And it was clear to me as a 25-year-old newly diagnosed patient that, there needed to be some work done in conjunction with what was already going on. So I'm going to try to pack in as much as I can. I know we're coming at the end of the hour, but I started this after I was diagnosed, and through that, I've been exposed to a much broader cross-section of patients and caregivers, both around the country and around the world, as well as there are many challenges navigating the healthcare systems. And as Durhan kind of said already, you know, we've primarily operated in the US here over the last 7 years, but we are bringing our foundation to the rest of the world to be inclusive of all these patients who are suffering in silence, without support, without access to therapies, virtually on every corner of the planet. And I come at this from a different perspective, perhaps because I myself am a minority on all fronts. I am the child of immigrants from developing nations. I identify as a Muslim. I'm a woman. And unfortunately, in 2021, being a female leader is still considered a minority. I speak different languages. So again, I think I come at this from a little bit of a different angle. And so I empathize with those people who have such challenges, you know, in the healthcare system. And because of my advocacy work, I am frequently contacted by patients and caregivers all over the planet who are in desperate situations, in need of support to identify specialists in the field, receive appropriate diagnostics, receive a proper diagnosis after being misdiagnosed for years. I've observed over the last 7 years that oftentimes it is the minorities of all types who seem to frequently fall between the cracks. They get overlooked. They're not believed by HCPs and experience grave and real challenges accessing care and even getting diagnosed, which is to me a basic. And what I've learned over the last 7 years in my advocacy work are these observations that pose major barriers in the context of equity in healthcare. Race is obviously a very huge thing. We know this, yet there are still so many issues around it. Creed, rural or inner city communities, being from a lower socioeconomic background, not speaking English, education levels, sexual orientation, age, physical appearance, you know, maybe looking too healthy. I myself am always accused of looking too healthy despite having a rare disease. And that shouldn't be the case. You shouldn't judge a book by its cover because we're all going through something. So I know that, you know, we're losing time here, but what I want to say is that Durhan bringing us together in these sorts of formats, discussing ways in which we can elevate DEI for these patients who never asked to get sick is important work. And I think it's the beginning of real change that can happen. I think we need to do better for each other by denying care to those around us because they're different from what we understand is a complete disservice. And I can say this, that I'm committed to being inclusive for not just the NMO community, but for rare disease patients, autoimmune disease patients, chronic illness patients across the planet. And that is a commitment that I have dedicated my life to. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much, number one, for all that you're doing and for how you're really reaching out across the globe. And also number two, for packing that into such a short time based on the needs here. Devorah just sent in a comment, which I think we all agree on, and that is we need to do this again. We need to have another panel. I was recently privileged to be on a panel where the Black Women's Health Council in the US has actually got a diversity for rare diseases council, which brings together all of the rare diseases in terms of diversity. And I think the recognition is that no single group can do it by itself. And I'm hoping that we can, in fact, I'm not hoping, we are planning, we will have another panel and we're going to talk about recommendations. But I'd like you all to think about, the ability for us to actually create some form of a diversity council that will be inclusive. And we also, Catherine calls it a DEIA task force, which I think would also be a way of thinking about it. What we're all saying, I think, is that we need to focus on it. If we don't recognize the diversity, if we don't have special, initiatives that address it, then we're not going to deal with it, but it's got to be inclusive. So I think all of you have brought amazing ideas to the table. I am so sorry, in my most ambitious way, I always think that we have so much more elasticity in the time than we actually do. But I'm hoping that each and every one of you who participated today would be willing to come back and let us have that follow-up where we can really talk about what's our next steps. and how are we going to actually ensure that as we're building this, as I call the rare drug program, it's going to be $1 billion investment. We need to take advantage of it to be able to make sure it really is no barriers, equity for all of our rare disease patients and families. So huge thanks to everybody that was on. I cannot thank you enough for sharing it, and for the active chat that was taking place as well. This recording will, this has been recorded. It will be available on YouTube. And then also the notes that are behind it, we're going to have it. Really, I think this is just the beginning for us in terms of being able to address this issue. You folks are also powerful in terms of not only your experiences, but the things that you're doing. We need to make this happen again. So kudos to everybody, and really a huge thanks to everybody for your participation. We will follow up with all of you. Yeah, love to all.
Thank you, Durhan.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.